The day Evelyn Carter returned to Willow House, the August heat clung to her skin like memory, thick, suffocating, and relentless. The mansion sat at the top of Briar Ridge like a monument to rot, its once white exterior now stained by time and secrets, its wraparound porch creaking like it still mourned. She hadn't stepped foot on that land in 17 years, not since the night of the fire, the night the truth had nearly burned with her inside it. At 18, she had been dragged out of that house in handcuffs, accused of arson and theft, blamed for destroying not only her family's legacy, but her mother's life. Her stepfather, Martin Holloway, the golden son of the Holloway timber fortune, had made sure her name was scrubbed from sympathy and branded instead with scandal. He'd stood on courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras, saying things like, "troubled girl," "mental instability," and "a tragedy we could not prevent." He was lying, but power had a way of sounding like truth when spoken through the right jawline. The charges were dropped months later when evidence quietly disappeared. But by then, Evelyn had lost everything: her inheritance, her home, her voice in the town of Hawthorne, Tennessee. She had fled north, rebuilt herself under her mother's maiden name, graduated law school, and spent years piecing together the real story that had been buried under ashes and media spin. But now she was back. Not for closure, she didn't believe in that. She came for justice. Willow House had been abandoned since the Holloway fortune collapsed 6 years ago. After a messy federal investigation into timberland corruption Martin barely slithered out of. The estate had gone into quiet foreclosure, and Evelyn, using a shell LLC, had purchased it anonymously for pennies on the dollar. She didn't want the house. She wanted the ghosts that still lingered there. Inside, the smell of mildew clung to the walls, mixing with the scent of burnt oak and varnish. The staircase she had once slid down as a girl was now warped, the chandelier above still blackened from the fire's smoke. But it was all still there: the locked study, the heavy safe under the floorboards, and the room her mother had spent her final months in, heavily medicated and silenced by Martin's careful control. Evelyn walked slowly through the halls, memories flooding with every step: her mother's distant eyes, her own screams unheard, Martin's calm voice saying, "It's all for the family." She had once believed that family meant protection, but Martin had redefined it as power, obedience, and secrets kept at any cost. Now Evelyn carried secrets of her own. Over the past year, she had assembled a portfolio of old financial records, long-lost affidavits, and medical reports, pieces of a larger puzzle Martin never expected anyone to hold. She had tracked down the old caretaker who had been fired mysteriously just days before the fire, and the nurse who had once confessed to over-medicating her mother under Holloway's orders. She had names, dates, signed statements, all of it, pointing not just to abuse, but to the carefully orchestrated erasure of a woman's voice and the manipulation of a stepdaughter blamed for standing in the way. Evelyn knew she couldn't erase the years Martin had stolen from her, but she could set fire to the myth he had built in their place. It would begin quietly, like all proper storms. That week, she moved into Willow House under her legal name Evie. Colburn sparking whispers in Hawthorne like dry leaves catching wind. People recognized her, even if they didn't admit it aloud. The pastor's wife froze when Evie walked into church. Her former best friend crossed the street instead of saying hello. But she wasn't there to be welcomed. She was there to be seen. She attended the town council meeting 3 nights later, wearing a cream linen dress and a smile as unreadable as fog. Martin, now graying but still smug in his tailored suit, sat at the center table, advisor to the city's historical redevelopment committee. The audacity didn't surprise her. Predators always returned to their hunting grounds. He didn't recognize her at first, not fully, but his eyes narrowed the longer she spoke. "I'm here to restore the legacy of Willow House," she said, evenly, "and ensure the full truth of its history is preserved." The words were polite. The threat beneath them was not. That night, she sent her first package, a copy of her mother's toxicology report and a timeline of withdrawals from her trust fund signed by Martin 3 days after the fire. She mailed it to a journalist who had once written a glowing piece about the resilience of the Holloways. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The story broke 3 days later, quietly at first a digital article on a regional outlet titled, "Was the Holloway Empire Built on Silence?" It began with questions, soft and polite, the way the press often danced near powerful men, but the content was unmistakable: inconsistencies in financial documents, the toxicology report Evelyn had uncovered, and the suspicious timeline of asset transfers following the night of the fire. The name Evelyn Carter was never mentioned, but in a town like Hawthorne, it didn't need to be. Whispers began curling around coffee shops and front porches, in the space between polite smiles and sudden glances. Martin Holloway, for his part, did what men like him always did: he denied, deflected, and reminded the town of all the charity work he'd funded over the years. "There's always someone out there looking to stir up the past," he said to the local news with his signature smirk. But Evelyn knew what he feared: momentum. And the momentum was building. She watched from the shadows as a second article followed, this time featuring an anonymous nurse's testimony. "They told me not to ask questions. Just give her the pills." Evelyn read it alone on the dusty floor of her childhood bedroom, the room Martin had converted into a wine cellar after her arrest. She didn't cry. There were no tears left for that house. Instead, she carefully opened the locked case beneath her bed containing her next move, a thumb drive labeled MBH confidential. The files it contained were hacked copies of old correspondence between Martin and his accountant, emails never meant to see daylight, recovered by a friend of Evelyn's who worked in cybersecurity. They weren't just damning, they were poetic in their arrogance. One email, dated 2 months before the fire, read, "Once she's out of the picture, we consolidate and move forward. She's too far gone to fight it." He was talking about her mother. Evelyn's stomach had tightened when she first read it, but now she felt only clarity. She knew what she had to do next. That evening, she uploaded a password-protected version of the drive to a legal advocacy firm that specialized in reopening closed abuse cases, along with a letter written under her real name. "This is not just about fraud," she wrote. "It's about erasure of a woman, of a daughter, of truth." By the end of the week, the firm confirmed receipt and quietly began to build a legal brief, nothing public yet, but a signal that the legal storm was not only coming, it was being architected with the precision of someone who'd waited years to strike. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her presence in town like a whisper rising in volume. She hosted an open restoration tour at Willow House, an invitation for the town to step inside the infamous mansion again, to see what remained, and more importantly, to remind them what they had allowed to be buried. People came, of course, out of curiosity, shame, nostalgia. They marveled at the antique mirrors, the half-burned piano, the staircase that now leaned under time. But it was what Evelyn had placed on the dining table that stole the breath from every throat who entered. A photo of her mother, radiant and gentle, with a handwritten letter beneath it. She wasn't crazy, it read. She was betrayed. No one asked who wrote it. No one needed to. By the end of the day, word had reached Martin that Evie Colburn was, in fact, Evelyn Carter. He showed up unannounced the following morning, driving the same black Cadillac he once drove her to high school in. When she opened the door, his face twitched between recognition and control. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, the same way he once said it the night of the fire. "You never should have made me leave," she replied. For a long moment, they just stood there, two ghosts in a house still haunted. Martin tried threats, first legal, financial, personal. Then he tried guilt. "Your mother was unstable. You were just a child. You didn't understand what was happening." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I understood enough to know you signed away," her breath like it was a line item. Finally, he reached for charm, the same velvet menace he'd used on courts and cameras for years. "You want money? Closure? You can have it. Just walk away. Let the past stay buried." Evelyn looked him in the eye and said with steel in her voice, "I don't want money. I want your name to rot." Then she closed the door on him slowly, letting it click shut like a chapter ending. The news broke like a thunderclap across Hawthorne. The Holloway estate was officially under investigation for fraudulent inheritance transfers and criminal financial misconduct tied to the Carter Trust, the very inheritance Evelyn had been accused of sabotaging years before. This time, the whistleblower wasn't anonymous. It was Evelyn. She submitted her own sworn affidavit to the Department of Justice, attaching the hacked emails, bank ledgers, and forensic audit of the missing Carter estate funds, all tracing back to Martin Holloway's private accounts in the Cayman Islands. Her name was no longer whispered in shame but printed in bold type. Evelyn Carter reclaimed story, exposes stepfather's decades of lies, and with that came the reckoning. Lawyers from Nashville arrived in Hawthorne within days. Federal agents in plain clothes stepped through the courthouse doors, and a grand jury was summoned. The town that once turned its back on her now found itself in the middle of a storm that Evelyn controlled with the precision of someone who had waited half her life to be heard. The mayor, who had once served on Martin's advisory board, suddenly found himself scrubbing his name from old endorsements. The Holloway Family Foundation removed its website overnight. Donors pulled support. Former employees stepped forward. Even the local minister, once so cozy with Martin during his fundraising brunches, awkwardly muttered in church about pride coming before the fall, but Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply watched, calm, controlled, focused. Willow House, once seen as the burned-out ruins of a scandal, had become a monument to resilience. Evelyn began holding weekly community gatherings on the front lawn, story circles for women whose voices had once been shut down, buried, or twisted into something ugly by men like Martin. She didn't speak much during these circles. She listened. Teen girls from the local high school showed up with journals. Widows shared confessions about wills they'd never understood. And slowly, the town began to change, not in public declarations, but in the soft, quiet rewiring of trust. Then came the day Evelyn walked into the courtroom, not as a defendant, not as a rumor, but as a plaintiff. Martin sat at the defense table, now noticeably aged, the edges of his voice trembling where confidence used to live. The opening statements were clear and brutal. Evidence of financial coercion, emotional abuse, medical negligence, and decades of fraud layered beneath the illusion of Southern gentility. Evelyn was called to testify on the second day, and when she stood before the court, her voice did not shake. She spoke of her mother, not just the woman on medication, but the vibrant artist who once painted the walls of Willow House in golds and lilacs before she was gaslighted into numbness. She spoke of the night of the fire, how she found files hidden behind her mother's dresser drawer, legal papers showing Martin had begun quietly transferring her mother's assets months before her death. She spoke of how, when she confronted him, the study door locked behind her, the smell of smoke filled the hallway, and all she remembered was shouting until blackness took over. And she spoke of the years after, the silence, the isolation, the long, bitter climb toward truth. When she finished, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom, not even a cough, just the weight of something irreversible. Martin's defense faltered. His lawyers tried to argue instability, misinterpretation, coincidence, but the documents didn't lie. The audio didn't lie. The nurse's sworn statements didn't lie. By the time the verdict came down, it was almost anticlimactic. Martin Holloway was found guilty on multiple counts of financial fraud, coercion, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to a minimum of 10 years, with further civil suits pending. Evelyn didn't attend his sentencing. Instead, she spent that day walking through the Willow House gardens, now cleared and planted anew. The old swing her mother once pushed her on had been restored. Jasmine bloomed along the fence. She sat on the bench beneath the willow tree that had once watched over her childhood and whispered, "We're free now." The wind rustled softly through the branches, as if in reply. Months passed, and the name Evelyn Carter no longer carried the shadow of scandal. It carried weight, respect, and something deeper, a quiet, earned reverence. The town of Hawthorne, once complicit in her exile, had begun to remember her differently, not as the troubled girl in the handcuffs, but as the woman who faced down the legacy of her abuser and won. Willow House, long abandoned and whispered about like a ghost story, was fully hers now, not just by deed, but by presence. She chose not to sell it. Instead, she restored it room by room, not to its former grandeur, but to something softer, freer, alive with truth. The wine cellar became a writing library where women could gather and share their stories. The East Wing, once sealed off during her mother's final months, was transformed into a community grief center. People came not for spectacle but for healing. Evelyn didn't make speeches. She simply showed up every morning to water the garden, every evening to read by the fireplace her mother once curled up near before Martin's control stole her joy. Sometimes late at night, she'd sit under the old willow tree, tea in hand, and listen to the silence, not the kind that used to crush her, but the kind that felt like peace earned through fire. She kept the original court documents in a locked drawer, not out of vengeance, but to remind herself how far she'd come. She never tried to erase what happened. She embraced it, every ugly corner, because only by walking through the ashes could she reclaim the ground beneath them. Word of her story spread far beyond Tennessee. A journalist who had once believed Martin's narrative asked to do a follow-up, this time with Evelyn at the center. The headline read, "The Woman Who Burned Down a Lie and Rebuilt the Truth." Scholarships were started in her mother's name, funded not by pity but by choice. A law school invited Evelyn to speak on survivor justice, and though she hesitated at first, she eventually stood behind the podium and said only this: "Justice isn't about punishing the past. It's about protecting the future from becoming the same thing." She never mentioned Martin's name again. She didn't have to. His legacy had crumbled not just in prison, but in memory. People stopped quoting him. They stopped inviting the Holloway name into rooms. The family estate, once dripping with reputation, became a byword for betrayal. Evelyn, meanwhile, flourished quietly. She fell in love with a local carpenter named Jude, a man who didn't flinch when he learned her past but leaned in with gentle understanding. He helped rebuild the garden trellis, fixed a swing set she once sat on as a girl, and never once tried to fix her. They were married beneath the willow tree in the fall, with no fanfare, just vows whispered in a golden light and the sound of leaves falling like soft applause. That day, Evelyn didn't wear white. She wore a deep green dress that matched the ivy clinging to the house walls, alive, wild, unbroken. The townspeople who once crossed streets to avoid her now stood up in celebration, not out of obligation, but because they had seen something rare: a woman return not to settle scores, but to plant something better in the soil where pain once lived. And in that, Evelyn Carter didn't just reclaim her home. She became the soul of it. Years later, a little girl would sit on that same swing under the willow tree, asking Evelyn why people said the house used to be haunted. Evelyn would smile and say, "It was, but not by ghosts, by silence." And we made sure it didn't stay that way. And the girl would laugh and run through the garden, her laughter trailing behind her like music through the trees. And Evelyn would sip her tea, close her eyes, and rest not in grief, not in rage, but in something better. She had not only survived the fire, she had become its light.